I think it's comforting to me in a way that we're all made from the same type of things. Like no matter how we look or act, right, we're all made of atoms. We're all made from the same atoms, types of atoms. Like there's no significant difference in atoms to atoms, right? So it's kind of like, and seeing the world through the atomic lens means that like, I understand what things are and that everything, the atomic nature of things. I think of more of a, and the same thing with like nutrient moving in the planet. I see it makes me think of things as more holistically than I might otherwise. And so, I view humanity as one giant endeavor. We have one planet. There's no planet B. Like all of the chemistry that's happening on the planet for life is important to everybody, right? And so I think it's helped give me a better appreciation for how we can affect the world and affect each other.
All right, my guest today is Dr. Kyle Grice, professor here at DePaul University in the chemistry department. Kyle, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Let's start with something very easy. What is chemistry?
Well, chemistry to me is the study of matter, which is really everything, right? But there's some limits there. So, if you look at things like particle physics, they look at particles that are subatomic, right? And chemists also think about atoms specifically. That's kind of our tool. And so we think about matter in terms of atoms. And atoms, we sometimes think about subatomic particles, which are things within atoms, like electrons, protons, and neutrons, but we don't get much smaller than that. Now, if you're a particle physicist, there's all sorts of fun things beneath that, like quarks and such, but as a chemist, I don't deal with that. My main interest is how the things we see in the world around us, the matter, the stuff, is its behavior and properties and functions are all defined by its atomic structure, so how the atoms are put together. And so, I try to understand the world around us by understanding the things we can't see, which are those atoms.
Mm-hmm. And can you go into can you explain the difference between organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing because those definitions have changed over the years. So inorganic, which is my field, is basically I get to play with the whole periodic table, which is mainly metals. And so inorganic is traditionally thought of as the chemistry of metals, whereas organic chemistry is traditionally thought of as the chemistry of carbon-containing molecules, or molecules that are primarily carbon-based with hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens, and a few other non-metal elements in there. And this really comes back from like hundreds of years ago when they were first, early chemists trying to understand the nature of material and realize they would differentiate between organic things from living objects. So organic back then was things come from life, things from bodily fluids or animals or plants, whereas inorganic was anything that was like minerals, non-living things. And then there was this big kind of revolution in that when the first chemist, I think it was Wohler, made urea, which is in urine, from inorganic stuff. And they're like, oh wait, we can make stuff that's in nature from non-nature things. So it doesn't necessarily mean that things that come from living objects are magical or special or in some way. Mm-hmm. But we still kept that differential language of organic being carbon-containing things, and mainly carbon-containing or carbon-based things, and then inorganic being everything else. And so I tend to see the lines blur between inorganic and organic, but there's still separate subfields within chemistry. And so sometimes we have organic chemists, people who focus on the organic molecules who use metals to do things, but they focus on the organic part. And then they'll have inorganic chemists like me who do very similar things, like maybe do transformations of organic molecules using the metals, but then we focus on the metal part. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of kind of overlap in those fields. I have colleagues who are technically organic chemists, but we can speak the same language, basically. Mm-hmm. We're both organometallic chemists, where we kind of bridge those two subfields of chemistry.
Now, many people are intimidated by the field of chemistry. Mm-hmm. What do you think we could do to make it more accessible to people?
Yeah, so I think the intimidation comes from the fact that it's hard to see. It's based on this abstract things we can't see, right? You can't see atoms, and so it's hard to kind of wrap that around. In addition, it's like learning a new language, right? And so learning a new language is challenging because you have to learn new words and new words, what those words mean. And so I think some of the best ways to learn a new language is immersion. And so I think one of the things we can do to help kind of lower those barriers for kind of intimidation or fear of things is to have students, and then again, this is in like K through 12, do science projects and realize that they can be scientists and they can do science and understand, the chemistry, let's say, that's related to whatever project they're doing. And by immersing yourself in it, you'll learn it faster. And so even at the college level, we're trying to do more of that as well. And so there's this concept of things, and this has been around for a while, called a CURE, a course-based undergraduate research experience, CURE. And so I've been trying to do more of those, where basically instead of saying, here's some stuff from a book, we're going to learn all this stuff, we say, okay, let's try to do some chemistry research projects. Let's try to do some challenging problems. And so we have a goal, and it's a research project, and the students are the ones driving the project, and so they get ownership of it. But then doing that, they immerse themselves in trying to solve this problem, and they learn the chemistry of that along the way. So yeah, I think it is challenging, because it'd be like hearing a foreign language and not understanding it, right? Like you have to. It's not something you just jump in and do. You have to learn that language, and that takes time and energy. And I think that being clear about that there is a whole another language basically that you have to learn early on will help too.
Following that train of thought, do you think chemistry should be taught at a younger age then?
I don't know. I think, I've got a child going through K through 12 right now, and, they're introduced to science concepts pretty early, which I think is good. But I do think that it takes a little bit of, it could be taught earlier. I think, so there's some great kids books on chemistry, and I've had, got some with my daughter and gone through them, and you can kind of get the concept of the atom and the atomic nature of things and how you can't see it, but it does affect it. But then there's a lot of the more rigorous details things. It takes a lot of kind of brain power and focus to do. And so again, I think we're probably not going to move it out of high school to an earlier age, that type of stuff. But I think we can teach about the atomic nature of matter early.
So chemistry is often thought of as the central science.
Yeah. We say that. I don't know if a lot of other people say that, but chemists like to think of ourselves or think of chemistry as being the central science, because it's involved in so many other areas. So for example, health and medicine, right? Biology, biochemistry or chemical biology. It's also involved in physics and physical things, engineering, environmental science, right? So many other fields involve things that are chemicals, because everything is a chemical. There's nothing that is not a chemical. And so, chemistry can provide value and information to those other fields. So that's why we call it a central science. Is we think of it kind of like it connects to many other things, and it's kind of at the center of all of these different kind of areas that are now connected through chemistry.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as Earth Day passed, how chemistry is certainly intertwined with the Earth.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Right. So even some of the Nobel Prizes, right, in chemistry relate to Earth science. And so one of my favorite examples of that is the chemistry of the ozone, right? So the ozone layer and the fixing of the hole is probably one of the best examples of an international global change that was successful and helped the environment. And it was a chemist, Mario Molina, and I'm forgetting the other name right now, but they were able to mimic the chemistry that was happening way up in the atmosphere in the lab, and observed and found out that really what was happening was these chlorofluorocarbons were releasing chlorine atoms, which were then destroying the ozone. Now, ozone is bad down here, but it's great up there because it protects us from harmful ultraviolet and other high energy rays from space. So yeah, it's definitely connected to Earth. I mean, water is a chemical, right? And then you think of all the nutrients that life needs, like nitrogen, phosphorus, minerals, right? These are all chemicals, right? So a lot of times, I think, again, that kind of central science idea, it relates to biology and earth science and geology and, environmental science. Yeah. So.
What do you think is the most controversial thing happening in the field of chemistry currently?
Oh man, there's always some controversies. And there's some small controversies and big controversies. Small controversies, I mean, like a paper will get published and it'll be like, oh, hey, this is crazy. But then it turns out to be false. And so, but I think some of the big challenges that are happening right now are kind of, are some of the same challenges that all science is facing, kind of like, respect for science in chemistry, or understanding of what science is or isn't, because, and getting the public to understand that. And so, because we see science through the lens of the media, and so we see like TV shows and news stories, and they usually don't really show science being done really as it is. They make it more quicker, more exciting, more dramatic, right? And so I think, and I see this with my students too, is they'll come in with these views of what science is, and it's not. It's not that. So kind of just like public understanding of science is a big problem, a big controversy, I think, too. But also the effect of AI is another big one right now. There's a lot of, with the growth of AI, generative AI models, people have been saying, oh, why can't we just use AI to do X, Y, or Z in research? And in some places you can do things and it can help, but it even, in some places it just makes no sense. So I have, students will try to use AI to answer chemistry questions and get it totally wrong, because an AI learning system is based as good as it's trained, and they're usually not trained on all of the chemistry background, right? They're just they're an aggregator.
Well, not yet, at least.
Not yet, at least. They could. They also can't access things that are behind paywalls, right? So like a lot of science is published and shared in journal articles. And journal articles you need to pay to get access to. Your library pays in the university. And so they can't find that information, right? Which is the core information for science.
Yeah, but open access has changed that a little bit.
Yes, but there's also issues with open access. And that's another, I would say, controversy-ish, is that people love the idea of open access, right? And I do too. But then the how is it done in practice is a problem, because traditionally papers are published in journals, which are run by organizations, publishing agencies. In general, when I write a paper, I don't pay anything. I don't get paid either. We do not get paid for our writings, unless you're writing a textbook and getting royalties or something. But we pay for the access to that journal so we can read all those papers. And that's how those journal publishers make money. But for open access, they've switched the model now where I have to pay if I want to publish open access. So in the era of tight budgets, suddenly saying, oh, hey, you guys have to pay some money to publish, so that it's open access is kind of a problem.
Yeah.
Right? We don't have that money, and they're not cheap. We're talking $5,000 sometimes, even more sometimes per paper that you're publishing. And again, I'm not going to pay for that out of my own pocket, right? It should be the university. There's also some issues with some publishers who have kind of a open access where they're almost the way they try to get you to pay them is kind of strange and not clear how it works, and so there's a few different models out there, but I don't think there's really a good agreement of who should pay for it yet, right? And so, for example, many departments will say we're not going to pay open access fees, or you have to pay for it off of a grant you have, where getting grants is very hard. So open access is definitely a big thing that's growing, and it's affecting the field in a good way, I think. Another thing is what's called preprints. The preprint servers idea was something that came out of biology, actually, and physics. The physics for the longest time had this thing called archive, and then biology created something called bioarchive, and then chemistry was a little slow, but they now have chemarchive. And these are preprint servers that now anyone can go look at. But the core problem with preprints is that they are not peer-reviewed yet. So they haven't gone through anonymous peer review where other researchers have looked at them and said they're legit or not. Yeah. And so there's still useful information, but you want to be careful about just because something's in a preprint doesn't mean it's correct or right. Right. And even a single scientific paper could be wrong. Mistakes get made, and that's normal. This is a human endeavor, science is, right? Yeah. We make mistakes, but for scientific consensus, and again, this is that issue with understanding how science works. For scientific consensus, you need many papers supporting the same idea, right? It needs to be reproducible, right? And so if you find one paper doing one thing and it's like, wow, that's really cool, but nobody else can reproduce it, something's wrong, right? That's not science. That's somebody made a mistake somewhere, or didn't write down the right thing and didn't report it right. It needs to be clear enough for you to go do the same thing. Like, if I publish a paper, it should be that anyone around the world, it could be in Russia, it could be in China, it should be in the US, can go do the same thing and get the same type of results and see the same stuff we did, if they have the similar tools and equipment and supplies. Right. And that's a big part of science.
I agree, yeah. So is it correct that 2.5% of our bodies are made up of metals?
Well, there's a significant amount, right? So there's lots of metals in our body. Now, of course, our bodies are mostly water. right? But then, and then organic molecules. But we have, think about, electrolytes. Sodium and potassium are metals. We have lots of them. Calcium is metals. We have that in our bones, our muscles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And then there's these transition metals, we call them, in the D block, in the middle of the periodic table, that are really important for life. Specifically, iron is the big one. I think offhand, I'd have to go look at the numbers, but you have something like 8 grams of iron in you. And then zinc and copper, we also have about a couple of grams each. And our bodies need those. We would die without them. And so we get them mostly from our diet, which is fine, but they play so many important roles that if there's a disruption in the way that your body processes and stores and eliminates these metals, there can be diseases. And so people don't necessarily think about that. Even our vitamins are metals. So cobalt is in vitamin B12. I mean, we need a teeny tiny bit of it. And if you don't get it in your diet or supplementation, you can actually have, again, some kind of issues with. There are people who have cobalt deficiencies and need just a tiny bit of cobalt.
Or have too much iron, right?
Or too much iron or too little. I think one of the most common disease states related to metals is anemia, right? It's just really common. There's lots of different types of it, right? But it's basically your body's not getting enough iron into itself from its diet, either through not getting enough iron or not getting enough bioavailable iron that it can process and move. And so there's all sorts of enzymes and proteins involved in gathering iron and storing iron. And so these are things called ferritin and transferritin, where they'll actually store iron as a nanoparticle surrounded by the protein in your body.
The irons are mostly in the blood, correct?
Yeah, well, so it's in the blood, it's everywhere. Every tissue has iron. But in the blood, they are in hemoglobin. So they are the central atom in hemoglobin. The heme is the small portion that surrounds the iron, and that shuttles oxygen. And so the chemistry of iron is what keeps us alive, right? It's its ability to bind oxygen but then release it to other tissues, to your brain, to your muscles, from your lungs is what iron is doing in our blood. But that's not the only thing it's doing. There's all sorts of other iron enzymes doing electron transfer, which is redox chemistry related to metabolism, or doing other types of for example, your liver, and we talk about drug metabolism. Your body's like excreting and processing things in your liver. It's an iron heme protein that's doing it. Cytochrome P450 is a iron heme protein. And so that's when the drug is metabolized, being oxidized by your body, that's the iron that's doing it in your liver. And so, there's people who look at biology and biological systems and health and ignore the metals. They're missing a big part of what's going on.
Yeah. And is copper primarily found in one part of the body throughout, or is it a higher percentage?
It's throughout. It depends on, I don't know off the top of my head if it's higher or lower in certain things, but again, like zinc and iron, it's pretty much well distributed and is needed in a lot of places. Copper is actually used for electron transfer as well. And so there's several different types of copper enzymes that have been found over the years into different classes, but it is involved in things like oxidation of tyrosine to make dopamine. It's involved in dealing with oxidative stress that our bodies make, like reactive oxygen species. There's a couple of enzymes called superoxide dismutase and superoxide reductase that are useful for breaking down superoxide, which is a reactive oxygen species in our bodies, and those are often copper-based. Even catalase, which is an enzyme that is everywhere on every tissue, that's iron-based, but it's also used to break down hydrogen peroxide. So if you've ever got an injury and someone put hydrogen peroxide in your skin and you see bubbles, that's the iron doing that. That's the iron center in catalase decomposing hydrogen peroxide into oxygen, which is safe for us, right? And water. So our body has these tools based on metals to make life happen.
So is it correct? I was reading somewhere, I don't know if this will fact check this, but is 99% of the human body comprised of 6 elements?
I mean, well, if you think about it, water is H and O, right? So there's 2 right there. All of our DNA, proteins, and lipids, and RNA, and cellulose and sugar are all carbon-based, right? They have a skeleton based on carbon. So there's the 3rd common element. Amino acids and DNA and RNA have nitrogen in them a lot. right? So that's another very common. These are non-metal elements. And then oxygen, right? We already mentioned that, but that's also in phosphate and bone, right? And then there's phosphorus, which is in our bones, and also ATP, ADP. The P in there is the phosphorus, and also in DNA and RNA. So it's lots of phosphorus in your body. Again, a non-metal, right? So that's almost 6 there.
Yeah.
So those comprise pretty much all the major classes of, or at least organic type molecules in the body.
Would you say that all living things have those 6 elements in them?
Yep, I would say that, at least in terms of how we understand life, right? Because life, if you take a biochemistry class, right, the main types of material, DNA, RNA, which are your nucleobase stuff, and then you've got your proteins, right, which is based on amino acids, and then you've got your lipids. Those are all based on carbon, all of them. They all have carbon in their backbone, and carbon chains is basically kind of how they're arranged. Sugars, same thing. So organic chemistry, sometimes the way we teach it, or when you start teaching it, it's like, hey, organic chemistry is your chemistry of life. Now that's not necessarily true, because you need other stuff too, but yes, all of the major classes of molecules in biochemistry are carbon-based. There was there's been again, these kind of like a couple papers here and there about life based on silicon, or life based on, arsenic instead of phosphorus, right? I think there was a science paper or Nature paper where they found what they thought was, DNA with arsenic instead of phosphorus. And I think that paper was debunked later. But, the problem is when you try to use a different element as the fundamental building block, your chemistry changes completely. Because each element is defined by its structure, which is that element's, every carbon atom is the same, basically. And so the carbon atom's structure and reactivity is what is the fundamental basis of life for those organic molecules. And if you change that to silicon, all your bond energies, which defines how stable something is or how it reacts with things, all change. And so then, all the things that life is doing, which is a bunch of chemical reactions, are going to have different behaviors, and then who knows how it's going to work. So I think, at least, I don't think it's going to be, personally, I don't think we're going to find life based on totally different elements under the same conditions that we live here on Earth, like 1 atmosphere of pressure-ish, and in the presence of water and oxygen.
Could you talk a little bit about your current research that you're conducting?
So I'm an inorganic chemist by training, but one of the things I've been trying to do is become more interdisciplinary and broaden my knowledge, so I can, learn more, because I love learning. I'm a lifelong learner. That's why I wanted to be a professor, was to learn and to teach and share knowledge. And so I've started to do a lot in what's called bioinorganic chemistry. And so a good, I'd say, third of my research lab or more is doing project related to that. And so what we're looking at is we're trying to understand the inorganic chemistry, so the metals, role in biology. And one big area is, it turns out that lots of enzymes or proteins do stuff using metals in their active sites, or where they're doing the stuff. So for example, when you breathe air in and you breathe CO2 out, there's an enzyme that speeds up the ability to move CO2 in and out of your blood and lungs, and that's called carbonic anhydrase. Well, it's a zinc enzyme. So if you don't have zinc there, it's not going to work. If you somehow stop the zinc or like cover it with something, it's not going to work. Now, there are some disease states that are related to these enzymes. So for example, there's an enzyme called histone deacetylase, which relates to DNA packing, and that's been found to be related to cancers. And so they've found that you can make a drug that will bind the zinc in that histone deacetylase, which stops it from doing what it can do, and then that shuts down the behavior of that cell, which, if it's a cancer cell, that's a good thing. Right? So there are some drugs out there that are focused on binding metals. We're now looking at, with a collaborator and I, we're looking at a dizinc enzyme that is related to antimicrobial resistance. So bacteria are developing, evolving defense mechanisms against the antibiotics we use. And so one of the things they've evolved or developed is an enzyme that chews up carbapenems and penicillins, which are these classes of antibiotics we've used for a long time. And so it turns out the enzyme that does that is a dizinc enzyme. So now we're studying that and trying to see, can we find something that can really stick on those two zincs and stop them from doing that? And that would mean that those superbugs, if they use that method of antibiotic resistance, they could be treated with regular antibiotics again. So my group is studying we're trying to make a small molecule mimic of the active site, so not saying the whole protein, but just the dizincs, and then trying to bind molecules to it that really well, and understand the structure of the binding and the energy of the binding. And when we find things that bind well, we have a collaborator, my friend and collaborator, who will then test them against the actual enzyme and see that, yes, if we see they bind well to zincs, they should also bind to zincs in the enzyme, and we should be able to slow down or shut down its activity. And then, for sure, this is kind of like the first fundamental steps in that type of research. So the next step would be, okay, let's test that in cells, not just on the isolated enzyme. And then you would move up kind of the ladder, and then eventually, if you wanted to pursue something for medicine, right, you'd test it in a variety of cells, you'd make sure it's not damaging the human cells, only to bacteria cells, etc. And then eventually it would go up to people studying it in animal models like mice. But we're fundamental researchers. We study the fundamental chemistry behind these things. Another bioinorganic area that I'm having a lot of fun with is metal-based drugs. So we already use metal-based drugs. There are drugs out there that are metal. Just think about, there's an anti-cancer drug called cisplatin. There's also the whole class of them based on that. Cisplatin was the first one, but carboplatin, oxaliplatin, a bunch of others being developed, and a few others, I think, with different names also out there already. And they're used for certain types of cancers. And so they work by metal doing something different than what carbon can do. In the cisplatin case, actually the platinum binds to DNA, and it binds to DNA in such a way that the cell can't replicate anymore, and then it shuts down and dies. And the hope is that more of it goes to the cancer cells because they're greedy and they're taking up more resources, and so then it kills them. So that's chemotherapy, right? So other places we see metals in drugs, it turns out Pepto-Bismol is a bismuth compound, which is actually, bismuth is the heaviest safe element where you can eat it and it's fine. Right next to bismuth is lead, and the other next to bismuth is polonium, which has been used to poison ex-KGB agents. So they're both dangerous and toxic, but bismuth is fine apparently. So there's some interesting work being done with bismuth. It's the heaviest safe element. And then lithium is used for bipolar disorder, right, and so on. So there's some other things already out there, but people are exploring all sorts of different things. And one of the compounds we've been looking at are gold compounds. And so gold has been used as medicine for thousands of years through traditional medicines, not really with scientific background, but a while ago, I would say in the I think it was in the 80s or so, people found that a molecular gold, not metal, but like a compound, was really good against rheumatoid arthritis, of all things. And so that led the path down to a bunch of other things. And so I have a colleague who studies enzymes related to inflammation, right? And so rheumatoid arthritis, inflammation, there's a connection there. And sure enough, we're finding that the gold compounds can inhibit that enzyme. And so we're looking at other ways that gold compounds could be used as a drug to treat inflammatory diseases. Again, right now we're doing the fundamental research with just the enzymes, and the next steps would be to kind of move up to cells with other collaborators in biology, biology departments who are good at studying that same chemistry but in cells.
Yeah.
And I've done a little bit of that with some collaborators. It's been a lot of fun to do some interdisciplinary work where we make a metal complex, characterize it, make sure it's pure, it is what we think it is, we give it to a biology professor, they test it in some cells and look at the results. And then we kind of work together to write papers and stuff.
Are you at the cell testing level with any of these things?
We've had some cell testing with the gold and platinum compounds a little bit, but not yet for the inflammation project. And so, but yeah, eventually we'll find some collaborators for that project. We've done it. I had an interesting collaboration a while ago where we were looking at a different type of. We were looking at liver cells and their kind of inflammation type stuff, and that was showing some interesting results. So yeah, so it's really, again, that's kind of like an interdisciplinary thing. You need to find ways of breaking outside of silos, right? And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't found some biology folks who could help. Because we have folks here in our department who can do cell line stuff, but that's not their focus, right?
Right. Do you know what gold was historically used, or what they attempted to use it for?
All sorts of things, right? It's if you look back in medicine, it's all sorts of things. People tended to use, gold as like a cure-all because they thought it was magical kind of thing. And the same thing with mercury. Mercury, because it was just the way it behaved was so unique, a liquid metal, quicksilver, they called it. It was used to treat a lot of things, which probably, not great because mercury is bad for you. But yeah, so it's. there's been a lot of, if you go back, there's lots of history on this stuff. I'm not a traditional medicine historian, but there's lots of great stuff out there about old alchemy documents about how they used gold and other metals as medicine.
Yeah. How did your interest in chemistry begin?
Yeah. Oof. I mean, that's a great one. So, growing up, it's always hard to tell like how things are going to turn out or why things turn out the way they do. Growing up, my parents were both artists, photographers actually. And I think that's maybe where the chemistry bug started, because we had a dark room in my house, and so I would go in there as a kid and watch them, and it was like magic, right? Watching an image appear on a blank piece of paper.
Yeah.
But they had like different chemicals that they would pour in there and mix and let it sit a certain amount of time, and then expose it to light a certain amount of time. And I didn't understand it, like how it was working, but I just thought it was really cool. And I remember I think in middle school, like in 6th grade, I had a science teacher, and I remember him doing something where he mixed some powders and like shot fire, and it's not a very simple thing, but that caught my attention, right? You could make things like kind of like almost like the chemistry of fireworks, basically, like how these like flashy things, right? And that's often how younger folks get interested in chemistry, is like bangs and colors and like
chemical
reactions, right? Yeah. So that's kind of where it started, and then in high school, I knew I wanted to be in science, but I didn't quite know what I was. I liked all science. I did well in my courses. I liked biology. I liked chemistry. I liked physics, and so by the time I was applying to college, I knew I wanted to be in the sciences. And so I went to a college that only really all of its majors were primarily science. You could get a humanities major, but everything else was science. Yeah. And so they required us to take a whole bunch of science classes our first semester. And then we didn't actually have to say which major we were until after that. So I had taken chemistry, physics, biology, and chemistry really spoke to me in terms of the understanding the world through the things we can't see, the atomic nature of the world. And so, because you could understand everything from explosions and fires to color to drugs and medicine, right? So I liked that it could kind of explain all of those things through this one field, and that we could that chemists could make things or create things, synthesize things that could make life better for people, right? And that's kind of like, either making medicines or making, fertilizers or just, changing the way we do things. I mean, if you look at the world of today, plastic is everywhere, right? And that wouldn't have happened. Plastics wouldn't have been made if it weren't for chemists studying materials and finding out like, oh, hey, this is an interesting material, and then can we do something with it? So I think, maybe middle school is when I was definitely science, and then high school kind of solidified that, and kind of like the end of high school, beginning of college, I was like, okay, definitely chemistry. And again, not that I didn't think other sciences was cool too, it's just that chemistry spoke to me the most.
Yeah.
I'd say that, I wanted to do chemistry, but there's lots of things you can do with chemistry. So like, I didn't know I wanted to be a professor yet when I was in college, right? I didn't know I wanted this job. But the thing that I did, for a while I was thinking maybe pre-med, or engineering or something, and so I did chemistry. And I could still with a chemistry degree, you can go and be a pre-med, or you can go and so some of my peers did, or you could go into graduate school and get a PhD, or you could go straight into industry. Like, there's so many different things you can do with chemistry. And so I decided that when I was in college, I wanted to be the idea person wherever I ended up. I wanted to be the person in charge of the lab, either in industry or academia, like driving the projects, working on the ideas, writing the papers. And so I knew I needed to go to grad school for that. And it was in grad school that I really realized I liked teaching, and I liked helping people learn, right? Because I TA'd, and when I TA in grad school, it wasn't like me helping a professor. I was the only one in the lab. So I had like a room of 24 students all doing organic chemistry lab, and I was the boss. I was the instructor. Because at these large PhD granting schools, like a professor will give this lecture to a lecture hall of 400 something people, and then the labs will be split up into 24, but each lab section has a PhD student as the instructor. And so I did some teaching, I did a lot of research. I also mentored undergrads in research. Our group was mostly PhDs, but we had a couple undergrads in the lab, and they'd always be assigned a PhD student to be their advisor. and like would help them with the project. And I had a great time working with this student whose work became part of my thesis. And it's funny because he went to grad school at UC San Diego, and I went to my postdoc at UC San Diego around the same time. So we basically both moved to San Diego around the same time. Him for starting his PhD in chemistry, and then me for doing what's called a postdoc, where after you get a PhD, often you do a couple of years somewhere else just to kind of broaden your resume before starting trying to apply for a professorship job. And so, yeah, I knew, like, in college I wanted to do chemistry and I wanted to get a PhD, but it wasn't until I was kind of in grad school that I was like, okay, I want to do teaching and be a professor.
Mm-hmm. Is that because there was a little more creativity involved, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it was not just creativity, but freedom, like, and joy, right? Mm-hmm. The joy came from helping people and seeing them like get it and get that, like, oh yeah, now I understand thing, and I still live for that. The creativity comes in that, yeah, it's, you learn stuff and there's, books and things, but in reality, science research is at the cutting edge of what knowledge is, right? When you're doing a PhD in research, or you're doing research on a research project that, you're doing things that maybe haven't been done before, or if they have been done before, maybe once or twice, and you're trying something new, you're kind of pushing at something to become the expert in it. And that kind of exploration, like, hey, nobody's done this reaction before ever, or nobody's discovered this type of reaction before, it's kind of a really cool thing. And then to be able to share that, right? It's not just enough to go in and do stuff in lab, right? That's fine, but the idea with science is that we share it and it becomes part of the literature. And so, by publishing papers in journals that people can read, now people can read it, learn from it, cite it in their own work, and grow. And so it's kind of like a global, I like to be part of the global scientific endeavor of trying to increase knowledge for the human race and trying to learn new things that can hopefully help people, right? And so, for example, my bioinorganic projects, in theory, could help folks learn about either metal-based drugs or targeting metal proteins. And so even if I don't get to be able to make a drug, the information I share could be useful to people also working on it. So I really liked that, that creativity of like coming up with something new, or trying a new way of tackling these chemistry problems, or like another just big part of good research that's kind of a hard thing to understand, I think, is connections, right? Because it's so easy to learn things in one area and be like, oh, okay, that's that. And learn another thing in another area and say, that's that. But real learning is like, okay, well, there's this connection between these two things. And here's how this affects that. And so that's more of going from a novice learning where it's like, okay, here's a bunch of things, to a more expert learning of like, okay, how are these systems connected? What affects what? What's independent? What's dependent? And seeing connections that people haven't seen before. And then being inspired to try things because of those connections. And that's why I like interdisciplinary work too, is because like you can kind of think outside of your own silo and get some new ideas from other people that maybe see things very differently to you. So I've really enjoyed, I teach a class that's a study abroad class where the students do research projects, but it's with a biologist. And so he and I let students pick research projects in chemistry or biology or broadly defined, and even though they're not in fields that we are experts in, we help them, and we get to learn new things too, and it's a lot of fun. And so, I really think that creativity is really powerful when doing scientific research, and I think students sometimes, again, because of what they've seen in the media, think that science is a very like objective and very kind of like you do this and that and that's the answer kind of thing. Like, no, there's a lot of trial and error, a lot of creativity and trying to come up with new ways of understanding or new ways of thinking about things. And yes, we do. It's science, so we do use the scientific method. But if you're creative, you can see new connections that other people haven't seen, and make new discoveries that other people haven't made.
Well, that being said, what do you think is the biggest misconception that the public have of the field of chemistry specifically?
Yeah, I think. Probably the misconceptions relate to kind of, again, science literacy, but like things like chemicals are dangerous, right? That idea, which is, or like if you can't pronounce it, it's not safe. Like those are silly, because there's all sorts of names for things, and some of them are systematic names you can't pronounce. Like I can give you a really long, crazy name for something, but it turns out to be just vitamin C, right? Like, just because you can't pronounce it doesn't mean it's dangerous. Yeah. And also, just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe, right? So the people will say like, oh, if it's I don't like chemicals, I'm going to use natural stuff. I'm like, okay, but which chemicals, right? Everything's a chemical. Natural things are chemicals. And so this kind of idea of like, oh, if it's man-made, it's bad, or if it's like a chemical that's made, it's bad versus a natural thing. And there's some good parts to that too. But again, things in nature can kill you. Like, don't go eat belladonna, right? Or don't go, there are unhealthy things in nature too, right? So I think that big misconception is kind of informs what a lot of people view when they see chemistry or think about chemistry. Is they think of like, oh, unnatural, dangerous chemicals. Oh, yes, everything has hazards, right? And there's danger for sure in science. But there's danger in any job, right? In any field. And so we learn about the safety and we, do the right things to take care of it. And things evolve over time. Like, they used to be that scientists would taste every chemical they made. That was one of the ways they characterized things. Now, those guys didn't live very long because, you're tasting something that's never been tested before, right? And so now we have gloves and we have lab coats and we have very good fume hoods and
you're not tasting everything.
And we're not tasting things, and so safety and health have evolved. But it's I think the public view of science being kind of influenced by these kind of very simplified, natural versus unnatural ideas, or organic versus, chemistry idea. Where to me as a chemist, I see it's all chemistry, right? Natural things are chemistry, organic things are chemistry. That like plants you're growing in your organic garden are full of chemicals. That's what they are. Chemicals are just anything with atoms, right? Which is everything, unless you're in the vacuum of space. And even there's chemistry.
Right. What would you say is the most surprising or beautiful discovery you've had in your research of?
Oh man, there's so many times where like you discover something, and I think the fun and beautiful stuff is when you something goes like, what? Like, that doesn't make sense, and then you try to figure out, and then you discover why or what. And you're like, oh wait, cool. So like, and that's part of like I think for my own research here at DePaul, like when I started, one of the cool things I found was that like there were some simple reactions that I had thought would just not work, right? Or would be like we're going to do them still just to double check, but they shouldn't be. And then they did work, and it was like, wait a minute, this really simple thing that we can study has not been reported on in the literature. And so I really enjoy like finding a simple, clear system where you can study something and get like a good understand what's going on. And sometimes they can be real simple things, right? And so a lot of times people look for science to be really flashy and big and like earth-shattering and change, but like I find things to be really beautiful. It's just like, hey, A causes B, and just a simple like, and then we can understand it and understand why and how. So for example, some examples from my other areas of research, I study how carbon dioxide can be recycled back into something useful. And early on, we found that it turns out that people had been using this very expensive metal, rhenium, which I still study for CO2 reduction, but it's expensive and it'd be great if we could use something cheaper. And people have tried moving to cheaper metals and more abundant metals and had some success. But then I tried just a commercially available compound, like something you can buy, it's relatively cheap, and it worked. And much better than I thought it would. And so I was like, hey, this is really cool. And that led us to a whole different, that area of research now. We're like studying this system that's kind of deviating from the kind of the paradigm or the norm in that field. And that's where a lot of discoveries get made, is when you find something that's different than what people are saying, oh, you have to do it this way, you have to do it this way, you have to do it this way, this is how it works. But does it have to? Let's try it. Let's see what else does work or doesn't work.
How does it reduce CO2?
So CO2, carbon dioxide, when you burn carbon, carbon dioxide is the most oxidized form of carbon. Now, life involves redox, which means changing oxidation states. So when you breathe in oxygen, we use that oxygen as a oxidizing agent to oxidize our fuel. For us, it's sugars and fats. And we take that energy and use it for our bodies. Now, and when you drive a car, you're burning gasoline, out comes CO2. That CO2 you cannot burn anymore. It's already what's called fully oxidized. And so if we can recycle that back into a fuel or back into something that could be a useful commodity chemical, using renewable energy, ideally, then we can kind of limit the amount of CO2 that goes in the atmosphere by capturing and recycling it instead. And so, you can't just capture it and then You can, I mean, but you can capture it and just like bury it or something, but it'd be great if we could capture it and use it to do something useful. So we look at how metal compounds, right, can be catalysts, so speed something up. Just like enzymes are catalysts, they speed up a reaction. But what we're doing is we're giving them electrons, which are electricity basically, and the metal compounds are shuttling those electrons into carbon dioxide, and that's how it's reducing them, is it's putting these reducing equivalents, which is electrons, into the CO2. And so we can make a variety of things. It's easy, not easy, it's more common to make carbon monoxide. Now carbon monoxide is a poisonous gas, right? So, but industrially it's an insanely valuable chemical. We use it to make anything that says acetic acid or acetate on it, all comes from carbon monoxide, which we get right now from coal or natural gas. So if you look at the back of a bottle of shampoo and it says something acetate or whatever, all of that comes from CO. The only acetate or acetic acid that we get from a more renewable resource is food grade vinegar, which is acetic acid. So like balsamic vinegar, white vinegar, those are from fermentation. But industrially, everything else, all of our acetic acid, including if you buy a bottle for a lab, is from coal or natural gas. So if we could make it from carbon dioxide instead, that would be cool. Another product you can make is what's called formic acid or formate. Formate and formic acid are less commonly used, but people are looking at it for fuel cells as a fuel, so direct formic acid fuel cells. People are looking at formic acid for, again, transfer hydrogenation or moving redox equivalents. Ideally, you could get it all the way down, reduce it, putting enough electrons in it to get all the way down to either methanol, which is a liquid fuel, or methane, which is natural gas. So I have a system that we found recently where we could turn CO2 all the way down to natural gas using a catalyst. Now it's not super efficient, so we can't it's not deployable, but just the fact that it can do that is pretty rare. And so we're studying that process, which goes all the way from the most oxidized form of carbon to the most reduced form of carbon. And so if you have a reduced form of carbon, that's a fuel. If you have an oxidized form of carbon, that's carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
And so nature, and like breathing is oxidation and reduction. We breathe in oxygen, the oxygen oxidizes something and gets reduced to water. Plants do the opposite. They do photosynthesis. They take in light energy and carbon dioxide and water, and they make sugar, which is a fuel. So they do the reverse reaction using light energy.
Yeah.
There's a whole field of chemistry and engineering called artificial photosynthesis, which is, can we find a way of doing what plants have figured out how to do over millions of years, right? Which is to take light and CO2 and water and make not sugar, but fuels or commodity chemicals. And lots of people are working on that.
Have you studied that at all? Or
I mean, so the CO2 reduction is part of that. It's just that, so that's CO2 reduction ideally would use light energy harvested electrons, which would be like solar cells, which would give you the energy, the electricity to do that. Yeah. And so you could either do it, have your catalyst separate from your light harvester, or some people are also looking at literally, and I've tried a little bit of this, where you just literally shine light on a system with your catalyst and CO2 in there, and you can convert the CO2 to other stuff.
That's an interesting field, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of it's all, we're inspired by nature, right? By chlorophyll, which is, again, a chemical. It's absorbing light and turning it to energy.
Yeah. How has studying chemistry impacted your humanity?
My humanity, right? Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of ways, right? So I think it's comforting to me in a way that we're all made from the same type of things. Like no matter how we look or act, right? We're all made of atoms. We're all made from the same atoms, types of atoms. Like there's no significant difference in atoms to atoms, right? So it's kind of like, and seeing the world through the atomic lens means that like, I understand what things are and that everything, the atomic nature things. I think of more of a, and the same thing with like nutrient moving in the planet. I see it makes me think of things as more holistically than I might otherwise. And so, I view humanity as one giant endeavor. We have one planet. There's no planet B. Like all of the chemistry that's happening on the planet for life is important to everybody, right? And so I think it's helped giving a better appreciation for how we can affect the world and affect each other. There is a great chemist who, his name gets tossed around for Nobel Prizes and stuff. He hasn't won one yet. He's living, and he has he's had a few kind of like editorials or things. He has a paper. One of the things he says in this paper is about when talking to people about being a chemist. He used to say that like when people ask him what he does, he used to say about talking about making drugs or like doing things and how chemists do things. And he decided that it might be easier, just to say this, which is, his name's George Whitesides, by the way, is to say this, which is, chemists change the way that we live and die. And that's pretty much it, right? Medicines are developed by chemists, but so are weapons. A famous example of both ends of that spectrum is Haber, who was a German scientist in World War I, and he won the Nobel Prize for discovering what's called the Haber-Bosch process, which is where pretty much all of our ammonia-based fertilizer and chemicals come from. He found a way to turn nitrogen gas, which is 80% of the air around us, into ammonia, which is a powerful precursor to fertilizer, explosives, etc. He was also the first person to use chemical weapons in war. He used chlorine gas in World War II, World War I. And so it turns out, I've heard this story. I haven't actually gone and seen if it's true myself, but I've heard that there's a cafe with all the pictures of the Nobel Prize winners near where they announce it, and his picture's upside down, right? Supposedly because of the horror of what he did to humanity for chemical weapons. But at the same time, without the resource that he discovered, we wouldn't have food, like as much agriculture as we do. We wouldn't have fertilizers, right? We would still be using, guano and animal waste and stuff and human waste for fertilizer, which is what they did back then.
It's interesting.
So it's, so I can see, like, and that's the other thing too, is like, if you understand the chemistry of things, you understand that, like, the chemistry is the chemistry. It's what you do with it that matters. The humanity of it is like what you do. Like, I know how to make things and do things, but I'm not going to make things and do things that hurt people, right? But at the same time, like, fundamentally, I think it's interesting to study, like, the science of what's called energetic materials, things that blow up. Like, why are their bonds so weak that they happen like this? What causes that, right? The fundamental chemistry is interesting, but I also recognize that if you're studying things that blow up, they could be used to blow up people, right?
Yeah, right.
So there are chemists doing all sorts of things, but chemists affect the way we live and die.
Simple yet profound statement.
Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit, I saw that you like to cook.
Yeah.
What is your favorite dish to prepare?
Oh man, I mean, so I took a cooking class in high school when I started cooking, and I really enjoyed learning how to cook, and it's a great skill to have. And so, I can cook a variety of things, and I'm not super fancy, at things, but I like cooking, like, Mexican and South American inspired food, enchiladas. I also like Asian inspired food and stir fries and stuff the like. So oftentimes, we just kind of cook whatever's easy and straightforward, but I really like, flavor and different spices from different cultures. When I was in college, before I was really sure I wanted to go into chemistry, I actually studied abroad in China, which was really cool. And so I like Chinese food, and it was cool to see, like, authentic Chinese food versus what we get in the most American Chinese restaurants. And it's different. It was a really good experience. And being able to study abroad and see different cultures, I think, is something that more folks should do in college if they can. So I always recommend students to try to study abroad if they can. But it's hard for science folks to do it, and that's why I created the program I did. Was a study abroad program for scientists. But yeah, I mean, it's, I'd say enchiladas are kind of like my go-to dish when I can't think of anything else. My wife's Persian. She's Iranian, and so we cook Persian food quite a bit, which uses a lot of things like turmeric, and there's also some great Persian restaurants in Chicago that we regularly go to. Yeah.
What book are you currently reading?
Ooh, yeah. So I love books. I'm a huge fan of books that are nonfiction but about science and history, and kind of like the interplay between humans and technology and science. And so I just finished a book called The Light Eaters, which is about it was written by a science journalist who got really curious about plant behavior and plants. And so she decided to write a book about it, and in her research, she went and met scientists who were biologists, doing all sorts of work with plant behavior and responses to stimuli and stuff. And it tosses around this idea of plant intelligence and, like, are they intelligent? What does that mean? It's really fun read for me, because it was, again, looking at a different field than my own. I've dabbled in some biology stuff, but like to see that, like talking to the scientists who are studying like how plants behave and why and all the cool experiments they discovered was real fun. That was a good book. And so I just finished that one. Haven't picked out my next nonfiction kind of science and history and society book, but I've read several. There's one called Salt. It's on the history of salt, which is really cool. There's this guy Sean Keane has written a bunch, including a biology one that's like the history of genetics and is a field, and the one that's on the history of neuroscience is a field. So he had some great books. He has some chemistry ones too, called The Disappearing Spoon and Caesar's Last Breath, which were both good. He also wrote one that I think is awesome, and I would love it to be kind of the focus of a class or something, called The Bastard Brigade. And it's about World War II. The US sent people to Europe, spies, to try to get the Nazi scientists that were trying to make a bomb. And so it was about some of that, but also one of the characters in that, and one of the people involved in that was a White Sox player who was a catcher, White Sox catcher named Mo Berg. And so he played a big role in that. It was amazing to see just a guy from Chicago, the White Sox, going to Europe and doing basically spy stuff. He was almost assassinated Heisenberg, who was a German scientist, but ended up capturing him instead. And so it's kind of these stories of science, like the kind of behind the scenes battles going on in science, and trying to get the scientists and figure out how far along were the Germans for making a nuclear weapon. And like it turned out they were kind of far along, but they were doing the wrong route and it wasn't going to work out. Their design was wrong. And so the way they found that out was, and again, it's all in this book, was they put them all the scientists they captured from Germany, they put in one house and they bugged the heck out of it and just listened. And they didn't say anything until they saw the news that the US had dropped the atomic bomb. Because then like, oh, whoa, the US got there first. Well, how did they do it? And like, so then I think they gave them some information about the design or something. They started talking about the design versus their design. But like, so like, eventually they did find out that yes, they had been working on a bomb, and they figured out where the uranium was hidden, or the nuclear material. I don't know if can't remember if it was uranium or not. But it was a really good story. And they're really a lot of drama, but true story, right? So those types of books are real fun. There's also a book that's fun called The Poisoner's Handbook. That's the history of forensic science, kind of like the first medical examiner this is actually in New York City in the 1920s. So it includes prohibition and like poisonings from bad alcohol. It includes carbon monoxide poisoning and how they figured that out, cyanide poisoning, old like kind of like poisoning and cases like where the really first time they used chemistry to try to solve like deaths basically. And so that was a really good fun book by Deborah Bloom, I think, called The Poisoner's Handbook. They made a PBS special that's about an hour. It's a fun special, and they do those reenactments and stuff in it. But those are fun. I highly recommend those books. So yeah, I try to find books like that, and so I'm not sure what my next book will be, but it'll be kind of like, again, science and history, technology, and humanity, basically.
Yeah. What's a piece of advice you'd have for someone that would like to get into the field of chemistry?
Yeah, I would say, if you want to get into chemistry, recognize that, especially if you're going into college, that learning is not going to happen just by itself. It takes work, but it also takes community. And so I think it's important to, reach out to and make connections with your faculty, with your peers, and work together in your learning. And because, again, this kind of idea of scientists being like by yourself, discovering everything all on your own, eureka, in the lab by yourself, is not real. It's a community of scientists. We're all trying to help each other. And if you get engaged with the community, again, it'll make things easier. And so, go meet your faculty, go meet your colleagues, study together with your peers. It really is the human element is important in chemistry, and so that's what would be my advice. And don't get and the other thing is don't get discouraged, right? And it turns out that learning through failure is one of the best ways to learn. And so when I do research, things don't work all the time. That's normal, right? And so, sometimes the first time I have a student, training them on research, and we do a reaction that just does not work. I'm like, well, that didn't work. They're like, oh no, what now? I'm like, no, it's good. We've learned something. That didn't work that way. It might work some other way. And we can go back to the literature and see what else has been done and find some other way of trying it. Or it might tell us that doesn't work at all, but it's still useful to know. So even quote unquote negative results are still good results.
Still useful, yeah.
Useful results. And so don't get discouraged by what seems like something not working. That's still something you can learn from.
What is the biggest threat to human survival?
Survival, yeah. I mean, well, again, it's not recognizing that we are in a limited resource, right? It's not recognizing the connectedness of everything, right? That like the atmosphere around us is impacted by everyone on the planet, not just us near it, right?
Yeah. But why do you think humans, we have collectively, most people have trouble wrapping their head around that?
It's because it's hard. It's perspective, right? We don't see that in our life. We see the things close to us. We see our house, our neighbors, our community, and that's what we see. That's how we see our world. And land is big, and so is atmosphere and the planet. And it's hard to, unless you are have the resources to travel the world constantly, you don't see much. People grow up sometimes and just don't leave their own little area and don't learn about the world except through media, which is, of course, showing things a certain way that may not be accurate. And, I was just reading a book to my daughter that's about astronauts called Astronauts, the Women in the Final Frontier, about the first women astronauts. And they were talking about the overview effect that astronauts get. When you go up into no matter what your beliefs or politics or whatever, when you go up and you see the planet as one giant whole, and you see there's no borders, right? The borders aren't real, right? They're just the lines drawn on the map. And you realize, oh, we're all together on this one planet, and we have to take care of it, and we have to take care of each other. But people, it's tough. We're evolved to survive, and sometimes survival is about doing stuff just near you and trying to get all the resources just for you and get what you need and not worry about other people. But the holistic view, I think, is what is needed for helping the planet. I mean, the planet will survive without us. Life will survive without us. The question is, can we take care of ourselves and the planet to be able to sustain us for forevermore? I don't believe that we're ever going to colonize another planet. I don't think that's going to happen in the next 5,000 years.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, I appreciate the time.
All right.
And it's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much.